Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Real inspiration for real innovators. If you're looking for innovation and leadership transformation, your journey starts now.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Born, and from time to time, we like to take the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast live. This way, we have an opportunity to expose more people to the podcast. As I sit with you today, this podcast is now listened to in over 80 countries, which is really exciting. And it's a top 25 innovation podcast. So excited about the opportunity to bring this podcast live to you today on LinkedIn. And look, I would love for you to take a moment and just wherever you listen to podcasts, go ahead and subscribe. Well, today I am talking to my guest, and it's Bob Woosley. Bob is a national practice leader at Fraser and Dieter, and he's also the creator of a podcast of his own called the firm's Private Equity 360 podcast with Fraser and Dieter. So, he's also involved in the advisory practice at Fraser and Dieter. We work really well together, and I'm excited today because as we've been talking within our firm, there's been a lot of conversation about ESG and supply chain compliance. And I love the fact that we're going to lean in and get to have this conversation today with all of you. So welcome to the podcast, Bob.
Well, thank you, Natalie. Glad to be here.
Well, I just touched on your background just a little bit. I would love for you just to tell our listeners a little bit about your background and how you got started in your career.
Well, it's an interesting question because I think I majored in accounting because my roommate majored in it at the University of Georgia. Started my career at a big 8 firm that kind of dates me, Price Waterhouse, which is now PricewaterhouseCoopers. And I was lucky enough to become the first professional employee of Fraser and Dieter back in 1982. And so I've had a couple different runs here. I started the consulting practice here. I ran the audit practice, but then I became a little bit more entrepreneurial and left and did a fintech startup called Illumin that is still in existence and powers franchise organizations, CPA firms, and some financial institutions. And that experience kind of gave me an interesting perspective on the private equity community. I came back to Fraser Dieter to basically serve as chief strategy officer and growth officer for the firm, then running our private equity practice, which kind of leads into the ESG journey, and how that unfolded. And as you mentioned, I've been heavily involved in the different service streams in our advisory practice, which is really exciting. So that's a little bit about me.
That's awesome. Well, today we want to lean into this conversation about ESG. Even our title, we tried to make it a little bit provocative because it has been a topic that's been a bit provocative as we've looked around. But let's specifically talk about what do those letters mean, and then let's talk about what you're seeing in the landscape right now.
Yeah, they stand for environmental, social, and governance, ESG. And it's been an interesting journey understanding, the evolution of this thing. And to kind of take it back, Natalie, probably 5 or 6 years ago, I had never heard of it. Mm-hmm. And it got revealed to me because we were working with a lot of private equity firms. At the time, Fraser Dieter had a fund administration business. And what's that? That's where private equity firms outsource certain functions to a third party. And one of those functions is investor relations. So who invest in private equity firms? They're pension funds, big, teacher retirement funds. And they were driving a lot of the requirements for private equity firms to have an ESG program. So we jumped in and created that program in partnership with some really great technology providers. We have several private equity firms on that program, but that was really being driven by the pension funds wanting them to have it. And some of these private equity firms really pushed back on it, but some embraced it. But the real driver, I believe, was, okay, our investors need it. And why do the investors want it? It was really about, it wasn't wokeness at the time. It was about managing risk. They didn't want the private equity firms that they were putting money in to be putting money into companies that might not be able to grow because they're being challenged because they're big carbon emitters. I mean, it really came back to capitalism that was driving that. So that's how we clued in on it to begin with.
Well, it's interesting to hear you talk a little bit about that. So, part of the journey has been to really look at supply chain compliance and to
Yeah.
understand how this is really a supply chain compliance conversation. I know that as we've talked about this topic, I was pretty surprised to find out how it was hitting different customers and impacting different customers on their journey. And I'd love to share a little, maybe a story or two about some of the customers you've worked with and what you've seen them have to specifically face by taking that letter that comes in and maybe tossing it to the side and not understanding the impact of that.
Yeah, it's a great topic question because if you go back to, ESG and everybody's going, oh, okay, we got to do it. And then it got a lot of political pushback like, oh, this is woke, like your title, this is government overreach. We just don't want to do it. So that was kind of in the background. And so the letters ESG in many ways became toxic, like, oh, don't talk about ESG. But then what happened, which is kind of crazy, we started seeing a lot of companies out there, mainly public companies, make really definitive statements about where they were going to be on their carbon net zero projects and that type of thing. And a lot of it extended to their suppliers. So we started getting, think about mid-market private companies who are supplying public or global companies. They were starting to get letters from their customer going, look, in order for you to be a supplier for us, you've got to supply this information because we need it. Okay. And why do they need it? Some of it was being driven by regulations. Some of it was driven by the EU, the European Union. Some of it was being driven, and I'll talk about this, about states in particularly California that jumped ahead of the Securities Exchange Commission, and they published basically a law that said if you're doing business in California as defined or supplying companies in California, you've got to provide this decarbonization emission information. Nobody was calling it ESG. And then Amazon made an announcement. All their suppliers have to provide this information. Didn't call it ESG. And I think they're smart about that because they realized that that was kind of a toxic term. So what you're hearing a lot more now is like, okay, we need this emission decarbonization information. They're not calling it ESG. So a lot of the focus has been on the E, the emission part. Yes, there's still, particularly EU companies are more broader on the S and the G. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But then we started getting, clients. I got this letter. I'm going to lose my customer if I don't comply with this. Help us.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And at the same time, we saw our private equity clients went from, okay, our limited partners need to have it. And yeah, we kind of believe in it too. We're going to do it. But then one of their portfolio companies gets a letter, who's supplying a public company and going, okay, by 2025, you have to, they're giving them a little rope, get prepared. You've got to do this. And they're going, what? And it was starting to impact their ability to respond to requests for proposals.
Mm-hmm.
So it had a direct impact on revenue, so it moved from, okay, is it woke or, government overreach and all that stuff to, hey, I might lose my customer and not grow. And then it became real.
Right.
I mean, not that it wasn't real before, but like this is, our portfolio company, our company needs to grow, and this is going to inhibit our ability to do that. And that's really changed the game, in our opinion.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the role of chief sustainability officer. Like we're seeing that type of role come on the scene now. We're seeing a lot more conversation about sustainability. Is this kind of the new term that people are coining now to start moving away from ESG?
Yeah, I see that a lot. We see that a lot. Although you do see the titles director of ESG.
Mhm.
I see that title more in global companies that are not necessarily US based, but they're, maybe based in the EU, and where ESG is not as a toxic term as it might be in North America, particularly in the United States.
Mhm.
So yeah, you do see a lot of chief sustainability officers, that type of thing. But it's again, it's about, the challenges they have to do to measure and report decarbonization information. And I can talk a little bit about that if you want me to.
Yeah, I think this part would be really interesting. Like I go way back in my career, Bob, where I worked with a hotel company and we had a basically an app that we helped to care for and develop around helping each and every hotel understand their carbon footprint and how to lower it. And then they had different ways, different metrics, different things they would look at to lower that. So
Yeah.
obviously there's a bottom line impact to the organization. There's a sustainability request for the person staying in the hotel. We've all seen it, right? When we go to the hotel and it says, if you want to reuse this towel, hang it up. If you
Right.
don't, put it on the floor. And then even how frequently a room, for example, would even get cleaned. So we
Yeah.
do see in the world around us people kind of moving towards this. But what does that actually look like? And what would you say? What does it look like to comply? What do companies need to be thinking about? What do they need to be doing?
Yeah. And, thank goodness we have really experienced ESG experts at our firm, right? So I'm going to talk more basic, and give you some, I call it emissions 101, right? And so you may have heard of these same scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So scope 1 are measuring the direct emissions that are owned or controlled by a company. Scope 2 is the indirect emissions from the purchase of energy. Okay. And these are really defined terms, and there are ways you have to measure it. Where we're focused is on what's called scope 3. And that's all indirect emissions that occur in what's called in the value chain of the company. And you can insert supply chain. Okay. Now, an interesting development happened. We were all waiting for the Securities and Exchange Commission to issue their ruling, long awaited. It happened 3 weeks ago, and they said, you know what? We're not going to make public companies measure scope 3. And everybody went, oh, well, maybe this supply chain thing isn't real, right? But what really happened is everybody went, wait a minute, time out. There are thousands of companies that have already gone out. They're not retracting this. And then the state of California, they came out last fall and they said, we don't care what the SEC is doing. This is our rule, pretty liberal state. They jumped ahead. So think about all the public companies that are deemed to do business in the state of California. It's probably almost all of them, right?
Yeah.
So if you're a supplier to like Amazon or Target or anybody, we had one who was a Lego supplier, with a little toy company, and they got the letter, and a small company. So don't be fooled. Our message to your viewers and listeners, do not be fooled that the SEC did not require scope 3. In fact, we're making a press release on this tomorrow. It's totally in the mid-market private company supplier, their purview to be addressing this. Do not relax on this. So that's a little bit the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. And you may have heard a thing called SBT, science-based targets. You may have heard a term called net zero. So there are 3,000 public companies that have committed to net zero. And that means the emissions released equals the amount removed. Okay. So now to your earlier question, you think about a mid-market company who's supplying toilet paper, who knows what it is that to a public company, they're not prepared to do this. They lack the internal expertise. They lack the emission measurement tools and the information systems or controls around it. They just don't know how to do it. And that's where we're focused on. We're helping them do that and get ready to comply so they can keep their customer.
Wow. So this landscape continues to evolve and change, and just even as you're saying, there's different regulations being released. It just seems like in some ways it's a moving target. But I think what I'm hearing is your message to companies is while it may seem like some of the pieces of this are moving, it's not something that can be ignored. It's not the paper that you can just toss into the trash can and hope that it's not real. I think that companies should be stepping back, zooming out, looking at this and saying, how does thinking about sustainability impact me, impact my organization? What downstream vendors do I work with that if there is a challenge or an issue and they're going to send me that letter, I don't want to be on my heels now trying to figure out how to respond. I want to have already been thinking about that.
You're so right. And we've kind of bucketed mid-market suppliers into four categories. The first category is unaware, completely unaware. Haven't heard about this. There's probably another category I'm not that they don't sell their product or service to any public company. Think about the landscaper in your, that comes and cuts your grass, that type of thing. But let's focus on companies that supply to public or global companies.
Mm-hmm.
They may not have received anything yet. The second category is, oh yeah, they got something, but you know what? Target, the company I supply Target, I don't have to do this till 2026. So I'm not going to worry about it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But what they don't realize is there's a lot of legwork that has to happen before they do that. Right. And then you might have some that are got the letter and they're reaching out like, we need to take this seriously, or they couldn't respond to an RFP and they're reaching out for help. Okay. And then we have the fourth category, and this has really happened, where the customer fired them because they couldn't comply. And how crazy is that? So we put that in the panic category. Like, I lost my customer, help me, so that kind of thing. And that's kind of where we are. It's an interesting story, Natalie. We had we're doing a lot of briefings with financial institutions, lenders to mid-market companies to make them aware. And we did one with a pretty large, international bank. I won't mention their name on this podcast, but they had 20 or so of their commercial lenders up and down the Atlantic coast and the West Coast. And some of them would go, oh, this is woke, man. I mean, this is not really happening. And like 4 of the lenders go, oh, no, it's already happened. Our customers already called us and asked us for help. And so we're at Fraser and Dieter, we think there's a big snowball of information requests coming down the hill about to hit these mid-market customers. And they're going to move from the unaware to the aware to help me.
Mm-hmm.
And we think we're ahead of the curve on that because we've leaned in pretty heavily on this.
Do you think some people are waiting to see what happens in the administration to decide if they reply? Do you feel like a lot of people are kind of playing that waiting game? And could that be something that maybe bites them later on by not kind of wrapping their mind around this?
Yeah, it's a huge mistake to think like, let's say it goes red, right? But California is not backing off, right? So it's already, the cows are out of the barn. So I think that's a big mistake to do that. And I joke about this all the time. Like, let's put aside whether, decarbonization, however you feel about this politically, right? We've got, I joke that I'm not necessarily a big fan of the Internal Revenue Service. I hate, that I have to pay taxes and file my tax return. We have 2 floors on Fraser Dieter who help people comply with that, right? We're not making a value judgment here at Fraser Dieter about whether this is good or bad. We just know that, our North Star, as you probably know, Natalie, is helping companies grow and create value across their life cycle. And, keeping in good stead with your customer is no joke.
Right.
So I think you ignore it at your peril, to your point.
Wow. So let's say that someone does receive one of these letters, we need you to comply with this request by this date. What are the steps that they should be taking to ensure that they don't just take that letter and toss it into the trash can and then realize that either their customer is going to fire them, or when they go for the next RFQ, RFI, that they can't basically submit because they're missing key components? What would you say are the steps that they need to be walking out?
Besides contacting us.
Well, even including that, like what,
Yeah,
you get the letter in the mail, what's next?
Yeah, they're going to reach out for help because unless you're a really large, mid-market supplier and you've got that internal expertise, oh, we know what to do. We know how to measure this. You're going to need help. So we're doing workshop sessions. We're doing gap assessments with them like now. And it's not like, the fire bell is not like you're not running out for the exits right now. Let's get ready. And there's some steps you can do. I won't bore the audience with this right now, but there are definitely steps that can be taken. But you've got to get on it. You can't wait till the very end. And the other thing I want to say too is what's interesting about it. A lot of times when you're a CPA advisory firm, you're working with a CFO or the CIO, those type of people. You know who's really interested in this are the VP of sales, the chief growth officers, and those type of people. Because why? You imagine if you're the VP of sales and you got an opportunity for a customer and you couldn't respond to the RFP because there's a whole section in there. Tell us about your decarbonization program. Where are you on this? How are you measuring your results? How are you reporting annual progress on your goals and emissions? Oh, you don't have that? Sorry. Right.
Yeah.
So that got a whole different executive, seat interested in this, as they should be. They're like, look, it's like data security. There are a lot of vendors that are getting evaluated on their own data security. Do you have a SOC report and those type of things before you do business with us? This is no different. It's just new.
Mm-hmm. That's powerful. Well, I know that there's probably a lot more that you could cover on this topic. I know there's a lot more happening in the landscape, but what I love that we're talking about today is a real challenge that we're seeing, a real need that has to be met regardless of how people may feel about the landscape of this area and regardless of how people may however you may vote, right? We're seeing clients that need help in this space. We're seeing places where they are receiving those letters. So it's a very fascinating topic, which is why I wanted you to come on and talk about it, because as I've been immersed in this world through exposure to you, Bob, it's really interesting. We did have a question come in, and I do want to read this. This is great. Thank you for the question. It says, Bob, you spoke of financial institutions and the companies they work for and are moving from becoming aware of how heavily they need to keep in good stead with their customer values. How do you see the world of ESG services evolving as companies move towards prioritizing compliance? From your vantage point, will services always be in demand?
Well, we're making a big bet on that right now. And I'd like to think our firm is pretty entrepreneurial and sees the trend and get out in front of it. But if you asked, like, we're surveying all of our audit clients right now, and we're asking them, do you sell your product or service to public companies? And our phone's not ringing off the hook right now about, oh my gosh, help, help, help. But if you think about this progression from the unaware, as your question asked, to we need help, we're on the front end of it right now. So I think that every day that goes by, you're going to hear it's going to be much more in the purview of companies. And the institution that your questioner referred to, I was referring to commercial banks that are loaning money to these companies, right? Okay. And are being aware of a new risk that they may have to look at. But a lot of times, like, and to your earlier question, who's this company going to call? I got this letter, hey, do y'all have anybody who can help? Oh, CPA advisory firm, do y'all have anybody who can help? They could go to like a special, environmental consulting firm, but we think that's a mistake. We have an end-to-end process that goes all the way to measurement, reporting, controls, everything you need versus just one aspect of it. And the other comment I'm going to make is, we think the big four firms, everybody recognizes the one I used to work for, they're focused on the public companies. They're all in on making sure that public company can meet the SEC scope 1 and scope 2 emission disclosures, even though they're not required to do scope 3. We've got about 6,000 companies that are committed to do it anyway, despite the SEC. So they're focused there. We think we are in the right position to focus on the supply chain, the private companies that supply those public companies. It's a real white space. We're way ahead of our competition on that. And, I encourage anybody to contact us if they want to, do a gap assessment, a readiness assessment, just, a little workshop. Okay, where are you? Oh, who are you supplying? And we can get and look at what they've communicate to you already, or we may know what's going to be communicated to you, right? And get you ready to comply.
Oh, this has been awesome, Bob. Any final thoughts as we close out on our time today?
No, I just thank you for giving us an opportunity to speak on this. It's an interesting topic for sure. And like I said, 4 or 5 years ago, I didn't know anything about this. And man, it's like sweeping. But I think the big the big takeaway I would say is do not sleep on this. Put your political views aside. This is real. If you don't want to keep your customer, then fine, right? But if you want to expand revenue and make sure that you're ready to take on any customer that might be asking for this, then this is something you need to take seriously.
Wow, this is great. Bob, tell us one more time about the podcast that you lead so that everyone can find that.
Yeah, it's called Private Equity 360. It's focused on the private equity ecosystem. You can get it wherever you get your podcast, and love for you to listen in. We've done one on private equity ESG in the past. We're actually going to be doing one on how private equity firms are addressing the supply chain challenges with their portfolio companies. That's an upcoming episode. So please subscribe. And I'm the host and usually have several guests that ping off of each other and bring different perspectives to the topic.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you again for your time today, Bob. This has been fantastic, very interesting. And I appreciate the folks who threw questions in the chat as well. It's a really fun feature when we get to go live. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, to our listeners, thank you for joining the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Remember, don't just get out of the box, break the box and set it on fire. Let's go transform something.
Thank you for joining us for the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Be sure to subscribe to our show on iTunes. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Innovation Meets Leadership, and visit our site at innovationmeetsleadership.com for more innovation resources.
Hey, my new book is out, Set It on Fire, The Art of Innovation. Click on the link to learn more. And don't just get out of the box, break the box and set it on fire. Let's go transform something.